thank you all for being here. It's wonderful to see so much engagement around this issue. Thank you.
Yeah, Bridget! Woo! Yeah, Bridget!
Hello. Good evening and welcome to Understanding Occupy Wall Street. Our club is dedicated to enacting philosophical discourse on campus in our community. We organized this event today in response to the following question. What is the Occupy Wall Street movement? And how does this movement affect us? We have selected a panel of professors that we think have shed some light on these issues. I will now introduce the professors. Just wait for my sake. Jonathan Lee. Jonathan Lee is a philosophy professor and the chair of the department. He teaches courses such as history of modern philosophy, Africana philosophy, and European philosophy. Jill Tiefenthal. Jill is Colorado College's 13th president, as well as an economics professor whose research interests include labor economics, economics of the family, and development economics. Pedro de Araujo. Is an economics professor, originally from Brazil. He teaches the courses macroeconomics and applied econometrics. John Gould. John is a professor of political science and the chair of the department. He teaches the following courses: waging nonviolent struggle to democracy and markets and conduct of American foreign policies. Catherine Giuffre. Catherine is a sociology professor whose current research involves the social organization and creativity of innovation. She teaches the courses Communities and Networks, Sociology of Culture, and Social Theory. We will start with brief comments from each of the panelists. Then the format will consist of about 60 minutes of moderated discussion covering major related topics. Following that, 30 minutes of informal Q&A from the audience. Please, if you have comments, save them for the scheduled time. We ask you to be respectful of the panel, even if you disagree with the views. I would also like to take this moment to introduce Joel Aguirre.
It's Aigner. It's anybody who graduated from the class of '68 would remember my father, David Aigner, and my brother, Christopher Aigner, who's also an alumni of the school. But it's basically AIG, like the insurance company, and NER, nerd without the D.
Joel is the head of the Occupy movement in the Springs.
Well, director of the public relations.
Oh, director. He would probably be a good person to talk to. On a personal note, I would just like to say how proud I am to see all of you here. It shows we care. So give yourselves and the panel a round of applause to help get this started.
Okay, I'll start. John Gould from the Political Science Department. I'm going to keep this as quick as possible, and I think to an extent because I think people are going to be repeating what I've said. First of all, I just would say that I think to an extent, and we got the expert here, David, over there, who can maybe chime in on this later on, that this is really, the Occupy movement is a crisis or movement protesting a crisis of unfairness in the American system, both politically and economically, and the two, as you'll see, are deeply intertwined. I mean, I think we should just start off with one statistic that has been repeated a lot of late. It's from the Congressional Budget Office, which is a nonpartisan office, its statistics are generally seen as favoring either side. Both Republicans and Democrats, Tea Partiers, and even Occupy Wall Streeters can go to them for what they think is objective information. And the key statistics of all the blizzard that we've been getting is that since 1979, we've had the top 1% of the American population receive a 275% pay raise. Meanwhile, the bottom 20% has had to survive with just over a 0.5% increase in their real incomes per year. And this has led to a massive upward distribution of income, and also what I would call a crisis of equitable growth, which you might have noticed over the last 20 years has been painted over with a massive new wave of debt for the average American. And all you have to do is CC students look at the growing cost of the CC education, which is something that is uppermost in my mind. Over the last 20 years, the CC education has become about as affordable to the average middle-class family as a luxury yacht. And of course, students have to go into debt to cover that. And this year, I think in the spring of this year, just student debt alone will top $1 trillion. So we have a crisis of growth. And we're only talking about education here. We're not talking about houses, we're not talking about credit cards, we're not talking about cars and other things. Our consumption in this country has been funded by debt. And as long as the economy has been growing, the boats that were barely keeping afloat on this river of debt were keeping afloat. But now that the economy is not growing, all these boats are starting to sink. And so the Occupy Wall Street movement is essentially outrage at a sector that can pocket $1 trillion in additional profits, while so many of us have never had it worse. Okay, so that's just a hint at the economic crisis that I hope we'll look at in greater detail further down the panel. The second one is the crisis of political unfairness. It's a no-brainer to realize that since the 1970s, there's been an explosion of lobbyists. And both parties, Democrats and Republicans, have been walking to Wall Street with their hands out and receiving millions of dollars in campaign contributions. And of course, Wall Street has gotten what it's wanted, which is very, very favorable policies. And the second thing, part of this unfairness, is that we really see our system suffering from a particularly nasty form of deadlock. Now, this is endemic to the American system. Our founding fathers created a system that occasionally falls into deadlock, and that was built into the system. We were afraid of the tyranny of the majority, and probably rightly so, because the tyranny of the majority would be elected, and unless there were checks and balances on it, it could expropriate the wealthy class. But perhaps right now we think we might have gone, I think the Occupy Wall Street movement would say that we've gone a little bit too far. That right now access to real policy change appears to be unavailable to those who are really hurting. So I have a feeling that the Occupy Wall Street movement is also about this political crisis. And the sad thing is that for the lower 20% of this country, and probably the lower 50% of the income distribution in this country, nobody is really taking their interests into consideration. As we speak, a bipartisan committee of Republicans and Democrats are planning a round of extreme deficit cutbacks in American spending that will impact the people who use government services the most. Who are those people? The bottom 50%. And second of all, the U.S., I was looking at some OECD statistics that came out over the weekend. U.S. is already abysmally, I can't even say that, really, really bad at taking care of its neediest people. And all you have to do is look at some of these OECD statistics, and I'll just drop it off here. If you take a look at the United States and how it ranks among the world's richest countries, and this is the list that starts with Iceland and Norway and ends with Mexico and Turkey, right? The richest countries. We are in the bottom 5 in overall social justice, overall poverty prevention, the overall poverty rate, and child poverty. We're in the bottom 10 in senior citizen poverty. We are in the bottom 5 in terms of our income inequality. Pre-primary education, we're in the bottom 10. And the only thing that we're actually doing relatively well at, and that means we're in the bottom 15, but hey, that's also the top 15, right? Is intergenerational justice rating, which means essentially that we actually have a reasonably decent promise from the current generation to the retiring generation that will actually be able to take care of them after they retire. So, in effect, I would say that, and we can talk about that, this really isn't a crisis of equality as much as this is a crisis of unfairness. The system feels and looks, and increasingly is in reality, rigged against certain groups of the American people against other groups of the American people. And I would call that class warfare, but it's not the class warfare that you hear about, talked about on right-wing talk show radio shows. It's actually a class warfare that redistributes income from the bottom upwards. So let's leave it at that. That's my kind of overview of what the Occupy Wall Street movement is being driven by, and we can talk about it. John.
Yeah.
I'll keep my remarks really brief too. I'm a philosopher, and so sort of by definition, my connection to the real world is always a tad tenuous. So keep that in mind. Say what I have to say. There are two basic questions about the Occupy Wall Street movement, the Occupy movement, that have seemed to me most interesting. The first is the question or the worry or the critique that the movement is making no demands. And the second thing that interests me is the whole question of occupation. This is not just a demonstration. It's not like back in the 1960s when we'd go demonstrate at the Pentagon against the Vietnam War for a day or two. It's an occupation, and that's something different. So these two things seem to be interesting. And I'm just going to echo some of what John said, but at a much more theoretical, philosophical level, by just saying, it seems to me, with respect to the first issue, the question of demands, the demands are really obvious. And you have to have your head stuck in the ground not to understand what the demands are. The demand is simply for something like economic justice, period. If you try to specify that in terms of particular demands, which I think many people would like to see the Occupy movement do, that might be profitable. But the problem, I think, is that if you do that, you're really just talking about how we might reform the currently existing system, how we might make better something which, as John has pointed out, is really not good at all. But if you think, as I think many of the people in the Occupy movement do, that the system itself as it currently exists is actually not just imperfect, but broken, fundamentally unjust, not just accidentally unjust. If you think the system itself is broken, then if you think within the framework of the system, you just basically can't solve the problem. So in a way, you can't make specific demands, because what you're asking for, I think, is a radical transformation of the system. So I would say, and you can give me lots of trouble for this, but I would say that the Occupy movement is in a way echoing a sentiment, a belief, a statement made back in May of 1968 during the great Paris demonstrations that almost brought the de Gaulle government down. When the Situationists said, this is a slogan painted on the streets and on posters, "Be realistic, demand the impossible." I think that's right. If you only ask for what's possible, you're staying within the system that's unjust. Okay. More concretely then, I think that the demand for economic justice is, within the Occupy movement, so far as I can tell, best understood as a demand for economic, social, and political behaviors that are characterized by a radical and non-hierarchical participatory democracy. I'll just say that again. A radical, non-hierarchical, participatory democracy. That means you don't have leaders. You might have spokespeople, but you don't have leaders. You don't have clear platforms because they're constantly evolving. It means, for example, that you have everyday general assemblies at which the problems that arise are dealt with. You don't delegate this power to others, you take it upon yourselves, but you also recognize that it's messy and complicated and it's not easy. So here I guess I would echo again what John said, that the Occupy movement has also a global dimension. And if you think back, some of you will remember this and some of you just know about it, but if you think back to 1999 and the enormous demonstrations, police riots in Seattle surrounding the meeting of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, what was the issue? The fundamental issue was, why don't we, the people, have some kind of democratic voice in the economic decisions that are being made that shape our lives? If you think back to 2001 and the demonstrations, the police riots in Genoa, Italy, surrounding the meeting of the G8 leaders, what was the issue? The issue is, why don't we, the people, have some sort of voice in the economic decisions that are being made that structure our lives? If you think about the ongoing demonstrations, mostly police riots, in Athens, Greece, even as we speak, what's the issue? The Greeks don't have a voice in their future. Now, Greece is a complicated case, I won't want to go there. But nevertheless, people's lives are essentially not within their control. And so the demand for economic justice, the demand for what I would call, and I'll say it again, radical, non-hierarchical, participatory democracies, and you put that in the plural, is really a demand that is central to what the movement is about. And that's my first issue. My second issue, why occupation? Why not just have a nice demonstration next Saturday, make a lot of noise, maybe a few people get arrested, sort of make the point, carry signs. I think what's beautiful about the Occupy movement, and it's something that makes it very hard for me to actively participate, honestly, because I have a life and a job, But what I really love about it, what I think is really important about it, is that it shows dramatically that there is an alternative to the existing system. It shows that you can have a radical, non-hierarchical, participatory democracy, that you can deal with all sorts of unexpected problems through such a system, and that in short, it's totally realistic to demand the impossible. So, to sum it up, because I don't want to go on too long, but I would say that what we see in the Occupy movement around the country and indeed around the world is, in its radical, non-hierarchical, participatory, democratic demand for economic justice, what we see is the beginnings of a kind of demonstration to the world that anarchism is possible. And I do believe that this is an anarchistic moment. Thanks.
When I agreed to be in the panel, I don't think this is working.
Is that on?
So when I agreed to be in the panel, I was kind of skeptical about what am I going to talk about as an economist? We need data to be able to figure things out after they happen. And it's happening right now. So I figured that the best thing for me to do here is to talk about income inequality and to talk about the things that we know and so give you some information about income inequality and how do we see it. And afterwards also provide some information about, as economists, we don't necessarily disagree that inequality is bad, but we do agree that some inequality is not as bad as it seems. So, not to repeat what John has said, in terms of the information that we have, so I'm just complementing your information, between 1979 and 2007, actually all the incomes grew on average by 62%. Right, so everybody is better off. Right? The bottom 20% grew by 18%, right? While the top 1% grew by 275. So obviously what that led is that the top 1% in 1970 had about 8% of total income. Now the top 1% has about a quarter of total income. Right? So this is the magnitude of income inequality over, right, this period in the United States. However, income inequality before the 70s actually was decreasing. If we look at income inequality from 1928 up to 1960, it was really high in 28, and then it decreased all the way up to the 70s. And now we're seeing, you know, this income inequality skyrocket. In fact, believe it or not, there's a study by the Federal Reserve in 2011 that shows that after the crisis, below median families are better off relative to the top 1%. Right? So this is based on asset structures. Right? So there is this data on yes, there's definitely an increase in income inequality, but let's also think about the following. When we talk about the top 1%, we're not talking about the same people over time. Right? So what we're talking about is, so what economists have to say, there's upward and downward mobility on the income structure of a society. So there's a paper by, there's a report by the Treasury in 2007 that says that between 1996 and 2005, less than 40% of the people that were the top 1% remained at the top 1% in 2005. Only 25% of those people remained in the top 1%. So what we see is actually people moving from the bottom to the top, and people moving from the top to the bottom. Right? These are things that we see out there. There's other studies that show that if we look at income inequality at the county level, right? So we look at counties in the United States. Right, from the 1990 to 2005, all the income inequality generated for those counties were produced by only two regions in the United States, New York and the Silicon Valley. If you take New York and the Silicon Valley away, in terms of the county demographics, you don't see a lot of inequality increasing. So you definitely see, this is what we call the growth of inequality due to the growth in information technology, right? So this was what has happened in the 90s. Now, on a more theoretical level, what are the possible causes of inequality? You know, why do we care? Well, one possibility is how do we explain this? Right? One possibility could be that we have various productivity differentials. That is, we have people that are more productive than others, so they earn their fair share and they make more relative to others. Right? This is the hypothesis that can be tested. If you actually test this hypothesis in the United States, you're going to see that that doesn't account for the degree of inequality that we see here. It does account for some, but it doesn't account for that change in inequality. So there must be something else. Right? So what else could account for inequality? Well, the other thing could be the progressivity of taxes. Right? So if you think about it, if we're taxing the rich more relative to the poor, right, that's going to have a redistribution effect, right? And it's going to make society a little bit more equal. If you look at the United States in comparison to other OECD countries, we have the least progressive amount of taxes. That is, we tax the rich relative to the poor the least. Right? So this actually could contribute to more inequality. Now, but if we just look at that, does that explain the entire inequality? No. Right? This is part of the explanation, but not the explanation for why we see this being unequal. The other explanation, it has to do with productivity, is you do see a difference in educational attainment between the top 20% and let's say the bottom 80%. Right? So these are just facts, right? So on average, the top 20% is more educated relative to the bottom 80%. Now, is this something that has to do with the top 20% is more intelligent than the bottom? No, absolutely not. Right? It could just be that the top 20% have more access to education and had more access to a liberal arts education, to good colleges, right? And the bottom 80 didn't have, right? And that actually creates in the market, right, different income differentials, right? So if we combine all of this, it still doesn't explain the level of inequality that we see in the United States, right? So the answer, so if, as an economist, we think of inequality as not a, it's a symptom of something, right? So it is the cause, it's not the cause of something, it's what results from behaviors in a particular system, right? That's how we see inequality. So the question becomes, why is inequality bad, right? Why do we have a problem with inequality? And there are a couple of reasons for why we think as economists that it's not a good thing. So one thing is a very high level of inequality. And we're talking about inequality beyond the poverty line. So obviously for people that are below the poverty line, there's like an economic argument. It's just a moral argument that these people should be above the poverty line. There's no, I don't think there's any argument about that. But for the inequality for the people that are already above the poverty line, high inequality would lead to inefficient allocation of resources, right? So what ends up happening is that if you don't make a lot of money, right, you don't have access to credit. You can't borrow, right? So in the period of economic crisis, if you can't borrow and you can't consume, well, you're going to be worse off, right? Who has access to credit? The top 1 or 5%. Right? So this is a big problem. It creates inefficiency, right, in the system. Also, we know that if you have a middle class, the middle class in terms of this marginal savings rate, that is not the total amount of savings, but the percentage of savings relative to income, that's the group of individuals that save the most. So more inequality, what you're doing is you're getting rid of the middle class, right? So you're getting rid of savings. If you get rid of savings, you're in a sense getting rid of investment, or you're relying on foreign capital to invest in your own country, right? So this also could lead to an inefficient allocation of resources, right? So we would prefer to see a more equal distribution of income, not perfect equality, but a more equal distribution of income, not to the extreme that you see here in the United States. Now, the other thing that I think is more pertinent to the Occupy Wall Street is the other problem with income inequality is that what ends up happening, and it has to do with the political realm, is that if 1/4 of the wealth is concentrated on the top 1%, right? That promotes what we call rent-seeking behavior, right? So if you control, right, if you control 25% of the income, you also have more power relative to the others. If you have more power and you behave as if you only care about yourself, what you're going to promote are policies that are going to benefit yourself, not everybody else, right? This also creates what we call market failure, right? So there's need for the government to step in that particular situation. Now, also, the rent-seeking behavior, there's the other side of the story, right? It also promotes the idea that we would prefer these populist policies, right? Which is also has been shown in economic theory that it's not the best thing, right? We, as economists, usually the majority of us would not agree that a big government is the best thing. Right? So there are just two things that really cause misuse of resources. Now, finally, we don't think inequality at a certain level is that bad, right? And the reason is we believe in incentives as economists. So because we believe in incentives, if we live in a perfectly equal society, that gives us no incentive to do better. Right? So what you want to do, what you want to see is, I want to catch up to this individual that I see making a little bit more than I do. So I'm going to work for that. Right? This is what we behave. However, having said that, if you look at the data for the U.S., it would be incredibly difficult, right, for the bottom 10% to ever catch up to the top 5%, even if, right, they got the best education possible, even if they had the best subsidies from the government, even if they had the most redistributional policies out there in terms of income redistribution. Given the situation that we have now, you would still find a society that has some level of income inequality. So what we're trying to generate here is the government has a role to provide access to these basic needs so that everybody starts off at somewhat of an equal ground, right? And then you let, the economy work, right? You let the markets work. What's happening right now is that people don't have the same access, right? So we have people already that are at the top starting at different positions. So obviously, all that's going to imply is that you're going to have a high inequality, right? So, so if there's a role for the government here, from my perspective, and most economists would agree with this, would be to not necessarily redistribute the income to make us equal, but is to distribute the income in a way that would allow us to have the same opportunities, right? So that's usually what we agree as economists. And I'm not talking too much.
I want to talk a little bit about the decentralized structure of Occupy Wall Street. It seems that disturbs and unsettles a lot of people, and as some of the other panelists have talked about, the lack of specific demands seems to be something that Occupy Wall Street gets criticized for quite a lot. And what I want to talk about are some of the structures of successful and unsuccessful social movements. And when I started thinking about Occupy Wall Street, I have to say that I was thinking about it wrong. Because what I was thinking was, oh, this is an organization that needs to get it together. This is an organization that needs to think about the Montgomery bus boycott. What was great about the Montgomery bus boycott and what made it successful was it had a really specific goal. There was leadership, there were articulated demands, there were resources that were channeled towards those demands, and there was a sort of limited time, the space of a year you could achieve this. There was a target that can be attacked, that can be boycott, that can be hurt economically, and can be brought to its knees. And I was thinking, my original thinking was Occupy Wall Street needs to get it together. They need to think that way. And I realized over the course of thinking and reading and talking to a lot of people that I was really thinking about Occupy Wall Street in the wrong way, and that the analogy shouldn't be the Montgomery bus boycott. The analogy should really be Stonewall, the Stonewall riots of 1969. Because I was thinking about the history of gay rights in the United States, and certainly Stonewall was not the first time that LGBTQ people protested for equal rights in the United States. There were organizations that existed for decades. Before that, the great Frank Kameny, who died just last month, had been organizing for decades and demonstrating in Washington for a long time before Stonewall happened. But what Stonewall was a moment when people who had been voiceless, who'd been silenced, who'd been marginalized, who felt that they could never have any way of impacting, having an impact on the larger social, political system that was oppressing them, took to the streets. When they finally said, we've had enough. And the kids who rioted the first nights of Stonewall were kids. They were street kids. This was not an organized political movement. These were people who'd been pushed and pushed and pushed until their backs were up against the wall, and who finally said, without any pre-planning, we've had enough. The thing that made me think that Occupy Wall Street was analogous to this, however, wasn't that moment, although I think that moment is here, as some of the other panelists have said. It was what happened after Stonewall. What happened after Stonewall was all over the United States, dozens and dozens and dozens of organizations sprang up, each was in different places, with different issues that they wanted to talk about, that they wanted to have addressed, that they needed to speak about. And so Stonewall was the catalyst for the flowering of 1,000 different voices, 1,000 different issues. Because I think when something happens, like people are completely oppressed, feel they're completely voiceless, there's not just one issue. It's not just, we want the buses desegregated. There are 1,000 different issues, and I was really thinking that the goal, the important victory, was to give voice to the voiceless. And that's what's going on here. One of the things that wasn't said about me in the introduction is actually I'm a specialist in Polynesian societies. I do my field research in the South Pacific. And in the South Pacific and Polynesia, a lot of the societies there organize themselves on a family basis. They're tribes, they're families. And what happens in a family meeting is when a decision has to be made, what are we going to do with this piece of land? Land is a big thing in the South Pacific for obvious reasons. There's not a lot of it. The whole family gets together and everyone gets to speak as much as they want for as long as they want about whatever they need to speak about. And that is the organization, and it works very well in Polynesia. One of the things that it means is sometimes decisions about what should happen don't happen for generations. And if you've ever been to one of these meetings, those of you who've ever been to for a few months, who've ever occupied Polynesia for a few months, know that the most important thing that happens there, though, is not that a decision is made. The most important thing that happens is the community is built. The community is held together, and that everyone has a voice. And that's what I was thinking about with Occupy Wall Street. Not that there needs to be one voice, there needs to be a lot of voices. There needs to be everyone's voice. I think that we start to see, just with that idea that everyone's going to have a voice, and that all of these issues are going to come to the fore. I would argue that Occupy Wall Street has already had a couple of victories. We've seen one this week where the major banks have decided not to enact their debit card fees to charge people to use their own money. I think that is yeah! That's a victory. The other victory is a victory over block break, which was a couple of days ago. I actually was in New York, and I went down to Zuccotti Park, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But I think there was another victory that I heard on the airplane coming back. I was flying from Dallas to Colorado Springs, and there were two men in the seats behind me, and they were talking. They were coming to Colorado Springs for a business meeting. And these did not seem to be men with whom I would politically agree on a whole lot of the issues. For example, they were discussing one of their female colleagues on the plane who was, I saw her, she was a woman in her 50s in a business suit carrying a briefcase, and they were talking about what a sweet girl she is. And that's not a sweet girl. And that's, so they were talking about sports, they were talking about all sorts of things that didn't make me think, oh, here's the radical left sitting on the plane behind me. And then they started talking about Occupy Wall Street. And one of them said to the other one, I've really been thinking about that a lot. And you know what occurred to me? Because they've been talking about the World Series. And they said, you know what occurred to me was, suppose all these sports stars who make all these millions of dollars, suppose after a certain amount, we taxed that really heavily and we gave that money to education. I mean, how many millions do people need? And I thought, that's a victory right there, that people are thinking about this, and it's occurring to them that maybe instead of everyone getting as much as they can and keeping it, that we can use some of the resources we have to build communities, to build stronger schools, to do all sorts of things. So I thought that's a victory. That's already a victory. So I don't think Occupy Wall Street needs to come up with their demands. I think their victories are already happening. I do want to say one thing that I noticed that was interesting being at Zuccotti Park was as I was walking around and I was talking to people and I was doing things, I thought, I recognize this. I recognize this somehow because over here is the library. There's all these books and people are in the library. And over here is food and people are going to this central place and being fed. And here's the dorms and there's people sleeping in tents. And I thought, oh my God, it's Colorado College. And the big thing, though, the big thing that made this Colorado College was that there were also dozens and dozens and dozens of different discussions happening everywhere. Small groups of people getting together, sharing information, sharing ideas, thinking about analysis of what's going on, really delving into issues. And I thought, if I can say Jonathan's phrase, I thought, my, look, it's a radical, non-hierarchical, participatory democracy. And that's what we do here all the time. In a way, what Occupy Wall Street is doing is bringing out into the world this very precious thing that we've gotten to have here that is, I think, and I might be slightly biased about this, I think is a really valuable, wonderful thing. And if Occupy Wall Street is bringing some of this out there, that's a third victory right there.
Well, it's great to be here tonight, and I want to add my thanks to the Active Philosophers Club for putting this all together. I follow a very distinguished panel of faculty and a great group of students put this together, and it reminds me why I came to Colorado College to see us all here tonight. I'm going to try to add a few things to much of what has already been said and maybe do a little summarizing. I think the crowd that we see here tonight is somewhat indicative of the country's fascination with this movement. I've been traveling around the country in the last 3 months, about 10 cities across the country, and I can tell you everywhere I go there's conversation about Occupy Wall Street. And I wondered a lot about why this fascination with this movement, and is it because everyone agrees? Absolutely not. I can tell you in the crowds that I've been visiting, many people do not agree, but everyone is still talking about it. And why is that? In fact, nationally, the polls tell us that about over half of people do view the movement favorably, about 54% in the most recent poll. But yet, even if people aren't all seeing it as positive, why are so many people talking about it? Even in these groups of people where I can tell you some of the alumni groups I've been in, donor groups, are do not view it over in a favorable way. So why? Well, a couple things I thought of. First of all, if you look nationally, despite the fact that not everyone views this movement or the parallel movement on the conservative side that some are saying, the Tea Party movement favorably, and those favorable numbers are even much lower, 81% of Americans do say that our country is on the wrong track. And I think that has something to do with really grabbing people's attention right now to say what's going on. And secondly, back to John's point earlier, is I think a lot of people are feeling, regardless of their politics, where they are feeling more and more powerless, both economic and politically, right now in our society. And I'm excited to see that young people in particular are finding new ways to assert their power in different ways right now. Third, I think that many people, regardless of their politics as well, are really captivated by the simplicity of the message. In some ways, the Tea Party seized on a simple message as well, with focusing on anti-government. And the success of Occupy Wall Street, I think, somewhat has been on the simplicity, which is, as Jonathan mentioned, economic justice, or as Pedro used the term, income or economic inequality. It's also been very well framed as income inequality or economic justice as 99%, right, which has been the very popular term that's been used out there. And hey, that's everybody almost, right? So that's a very, it's a very come-all kind of movement. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about income inequality, and Pedro mentioned some of the issues here. But I think when we think about income inequality, we can't just look at household income inequality. We have to also think about wage inequality. Because even though we have seen household income inequality, I mean, the inequality has grown, right, which is key. The issue is why now, right? Because inequality has been growing since 1970, and I can grant you that this is the first time in my adult life I can think of that income inequality has been such a topic of conversation on the national scene. So as an economist and sort of thinking about the politics of this, I've been trying to think of why now? Why are we more interested in income inequality now, even though it's been growing since 1960s? Well, one thing I think we have to turn to is that wage inequality has really been growing since the 1980s, wage inequality. And when I say income inequality versus wage inequality means households, and wage inequality means earners, right? And we have multiple earners per household, if you think about that, which is a really important issue. And since 1980, middle class wages have stagnated, and lower class wages have declined, and only upper class wages have increased in real terms. So even though Pedro's correct that everybody's been seeing their household income increase, wage earners since 1980, high school and below high school educated folks have seen their wages actually come down since 1980. So then you might say, well, still, why now? You're saying 1980. But if you think about what's happened, why has household income gone up while wages have come down? Yeah, more people working in the household. As women have joined the household, joined the workforce since the 1980s, people actually have been able to see their overall household income improve and get better, and their standard of living get better. Maybe standard of living, we could argue about time versus money. But on the other side of that, they have seen their money in the household go up. And the other thing I think that's really critical about why now is because of this issue with the value of our homes. A lot of people in the last decade have seen their overall household wealth and their ability to buy and their ability to borrow greatly increased as the housing market went crazy, right? Because a lot of people took home equity out, they were able to leverage that, they felt a lot richer even though they weren't. So households, so I would argue that even though, why is income inequality such a big issue now? Because everybody kind of felt like the votes were all going up together for a long time. And now with this issue of debt crisis with homes and the mortgage issues, and people now that bubble's been burst. And then the last point I just want to make about income inequality is that it has been growing, but in the last 3 years, as Pedro mentioned, we're beginning to see the data that's actually being reversed somewhat by the economic crisis. Now, does that mean that's necessarily going to be great for the middle, for the top to come down? Probably not, because it's more about that distribution and how it's changed in the last 40 years than where we are today. So I think this is an exciting time to talk about issues that we haven't talked about in our society for quite a while, and in some ways have been sort of a silent change that's been happening in our economics in this country since the 1960s, 1980s. The last thing I would just say, causes, right? The causes of this are pretty complex, much more. The message has been simple, and it's really captivated a lot of people about income inequality and economic justice. But the causes of this change are really complex, and maybe we'll get a chance to talk about that more tonight. But certainly, economists talk about two major reasons. One group of economists will talk mostly about the fact that we have market forces like increased trade, the flat society, jobs moving overseas for non-college educated workers, as well as technological advances changing that benefit that people get in the job market from their skills. And so that's probably the major cause of this. And if you look at the data, there's some evidence that that's true because only college graduates have experienced growth in median earnings since 1979. So high school graduates and high school dropouts have actually seen their wages come down since the 80s, while only college graduates have seen the real earnings growth since that time. So that does point to this issue around highly skilled versus labor in the marketplace. The other explanations are related to institutional forces, like deregulation, the decrease of union power in our country during the same time period, as well as stagnation in the minimum wage, which we all realize had a little bit of a growth a few years ago, but overall that real value of the minimum wage has declined incredibly in this time period that I'm talking about. So that gives you a little sense of the causes, although it's a pretty complicated discussion. It also has to do with taxation and some of the other issues. And then the hardest issue, of course, that we can't get to now, but maybe we'll get to in the discussion is the solutions. How the message is really simple. We've got economic injustice. The causes are somewhat complicated. The really hard ones, despite anarchy, the real hard ones are how do we fix this problem to really keep incentives in line, but also bring more economic justice to the American economy. I look forward to this.
That being said, we did prepare questions and have a few that we know we've been gathering questions from people outside for by Mrs. Warner and also online. So one thing that seems to be on a lot of people's
straight to the heart of my knowledge. Well, yes, this is a Supreme Court decision that gives corporations the rights to freedom of speech, and part of expressing their freedom of speech is the right to put their money where their mouth is, literally, and give large campaign donations without any kind of restrictions. This to restrict that is seen now legally as a restriction on the freedom of speech. So it leads to this great broader question: is why do corporations have the same kinds of rights as individuals? You know, when you look at the Declaration of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or even our Constitution, the Bill of Rights, you don't see the word corporation and corporate rights put in there, and so this is an important issue, and it's also again at the heart of, I think, what both Tea Partiers and Occupy Wall Street people would probably both agree is one of the problems, one of the sicknesses of the American political system, is that people with money, insiders with money, are writing the legislation, and they're getting the government policies that benefit them. This is part of the Pedro's rent-seeking issue. It's interesting to see an economist who's actually looked at all the other variables and found out that there is actually a role for that in explaining the change in income inequality. But I should turn this over to somebody else who probably knows more. Next.
All right. So I'm going to pose this question to Pedro. And so in our research, it seems that a major theme for Occupy Wall Street is questioning our financial system and banking system and the degree of regulation placed on it. So do you see any major problems in the systems that have really upset the protesters? What are your views in regards to that?
Yes. Any economist or any person would be very naive if they said that the system is working perfectly. In order for us to be able to have come up with the solutions or why is the system not working, it's a very complex question to answer. However, there are a couple of things that are obvious. They obviously have. If you look at the amount of regulation that we had previous to the 80s or 90s, right? We had actually more than what we've had the last 15 or 20 years. So if you look at, so what happens, right? What happens when you have less regulation? Well, banks and financial institutions, they are in the business of making profit. And they're going to do whatever they can to make a profit. It could be argued that this was one of the reasons why we saw the financial crisis. It wasn't just about housing prices, people. It was, yes, that was the key thing. But if we didn't have all of those securities that were sold, right? So if we didn't have the diversification of risk, right? When those mortgage-backed securities were issued, and then the credit default swaps, which were insurance policies on these CDOs, you would actually probably have seen a much smaller crash, right? There's actually some research about that that shows that. Would we see a recession? Absolutely. Would we see the magnitude of what we experienced? Probably not. So, does regulation play a role in this? Absolutely. Right? If we had better regulation, if we had better institutions in place, we could have probably prevented some of these practices. However, I don't have a solution for it. I don't know exactly what are the types of regulations that needs to take place. I'm not sure exactly. I'm not an expert in the financial systems, but for sure, the amount of regulation that we have now has been shown that it's probably not the optimal or the best amount that we should have. We should have a little bit more than what we have. So, but now the question is incredibly hard. The question is, yes, do we want more regulation? Sure, but then how much more? What type of regulation? What type of laws we need? I mean, it's a very complex issue. It's a simple answer, but it's very complex to work out, right? So just a short, this would just be a short answer to your question. I mean, with a little bit more regulation, if we can work this out, we probably would see better outcomes.
Could I add something there? One of the things I would say, a lot of economists will argue, and you've probably heard these arguments, for free market, we shouldn't regulate, overall outcomes will be better. But if you look at the financial crisis, you will see the flaw in that argument, which is the argument, as you've probably heard the term, too big to fail. And when you have a situation where you have too big to fail, what happens is what we economists call moral hazard. And moral hazard is this argument that people, so family, you know, there's two partners to this problem around the housing market regulation. One are the banks, and one are the folks who took loans that maybe they were either duped into, or some people actually took loans they couldn't afford to pay, right? And on this side, you have a lot of little people, and on this side, you have some very big people. And what happens when you have too big to fail is people make really good decisions on who to lend money to. But if you tell me, if I do really, really well, I get to keep all the profit, but if I do really, really poorly, you'll cover me. Guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to be riskier than I would if I was balancing both my upside and my downside. And so what regulation, and if you had too big to fail, which we did, because we know we bailed out the banks because they were too big to fail, we were worried what would happen with the rest of the system. We went in and saved banks as they thought they would. So guess what their incentives will be next time? Right? Even bigger to fail, right? And so the problem is, I think, in not having a regulated market in this case, is that if you were a true free market, which a lot of folks want, you never would have bailed them out, because the next time going through, they would have made the right market decision. But if we're going to do that, then we've got to make sure we don't give them these wrong incentives. And so we got the small folks who ended up paying the price, and those who were too big didn't have to pay their share of the problem.
Could I just add something as well? I mean, and again, on the other hand, you can have too much regulation as well. I mean, if we go back to the 70s when this all trend began, we had, one phone company, basically, completely controlled airlines, and on and on and on. There was, getting back to Pedro's earlier message, that a little inequality is not a bad thing. I mean, there were very, very closed, limited incentives to innovate and to provide better things for the American consumer. So is there, and how do you find that happy medium between too much and too little? And then once you got those regulators in place, who watches the regulators? Who regulates the regulators? So you've got these really, really tricky issues to solve.
So this movement has been compared to many other movements, both international and national. The largest day of demonstration in New York City is estimated around 7,000 to 10,000 people, versus on the same day in Rome, Madrid, and Barcelona, there was an estimated 200,000, 500,000 people protesting. So we were sort of wondering, to what extent do you think that there's an apt comparison between what's happening in the U.S. and what's happening abroad? And do you think that there are other international historical movements that might really tell us something about Occupy Wall Street and its future? And this is sort of open to anyone.
I mean, one of the things that we have to realize is that these European countries in the southern tier, they call them the pigs, right? Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain are undergoing self-inflicted austerity programs where they're cutting their budgets drastically in order to ensure that the country's spending doesn't go, that the country's spending goes down, so they won't have to borrow as much and they'll be able to meet their loan repayments. You know, and if we do have people, we do have a kind of a trend in our political system right now that would, a line of ideological thought that would like to inflict those same kind of drastic budget cuts on our own government. You know, to save the euro, this might be necessary in Europe. In the United States, we've got this thing called the dollar, which is the reserve currency, and people are willing to give it back to us once we spend it around the world at very, very low interest rates. And yet we're acting as if we are Greece or Italy. So I'm just predicting that we will probably see these numbers change if we are able to get through our Congress these drastic austerity measures that are being envisioned right now by our bipartisan budget committee. And it's just you know, I shouldn't ever make a prediction. So that's a real big giant asterisk predicted by a non-economist. So.
Well, as a philosopher, I certainly shouldn't make any predictions. I do. Oh, the word flies in the dust. It's David tells us. But I do think that at least there are two factors, two kind of obvious factors, why we might be seeing bigger demonstrations in some of the European countries than we have so far seen here. And one is that, although it may be hard to imagine, unemployment rates in Europe are far higher than they are here, and particularly for young people. College-educated 20 and 30-somethings in Europe, across Europe, are having an incredibly difficult time finding jobs. And so it's not as though it's easy here, but it's actually worse there. I think that's one relevant factor. And a second relevant factor, and again, this is an impression on my part, but I do think in many European countries, including the ones you mentioned, Vita, there's just a higher level of willingness to dialogue about political issues. You know, we somehow think it's almost impolite to talk politics, right? We were all brought up saying you shouldn't talk politics. And, you know, well, that's not the way it is in Europe. You talk politics all the time. It's part of what you do. And so I think, you know, I don't want to be too simplistic here, but we really have a funny culture when it comes to the unwillingness to actually engage political, economic, social difference. But I think John's right. I'll join him in the prediction. It will change.
But I just want to say something that I think it's not a good comparison to say New York versus Rome, because I think that leaves out a really important thing that's happening in the United States, which is Occupy Wall Street is not just in New York. It's you know, let's talk about Oakland, let's talk about Denver, let's talk about Colorado Springs. And I think that one of the things that's different in the United States is that we're so big and the issues are really diverse. So when I was in New York, I saw lots and lots of issues, but I have issues that would be my issues that are specific to living in Colorado Springs that maybe don't resonate there, but they resonate here. And so I think one of the things about that makes the decentralization of the movement important and I would argue ultimately successful is the fact that it's not just in New York. It's all over the country. And that's why I think there is this connection with what happened after Stonewall. It's not just one organization doing this, it's 1,000 organizations. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind.
This question is for Jill, but I'm sure you all might have something to say. A recent article in the Chronicle of Higher Education argued that the intellectual roots of Occupy Wall Street stem from left-wing theory taught in colleges and universities.
Here they are on the panel.
To what extent do you agree with this assessment? Are colleges acting as intellectual vanguards? And more generally, what do you think the relationship between colleges and social movements should be? And Jill, I would ask, what do you think the role of civic engagement should play in a student's higher education, specifically a liberal arts education? Do you think it's necessary or auxiliary to academics?
I would say there's a long history of college students being involved in movements, and my folks here who were from the 60s, 70s, and early 80s certainly remember that long history. And colleges have always, despite some of the criticism of the bias of, I'm going to put that in quotes, of college professors and college education right now, there's been a long history. And part of that is the opportunity that college students have. You know, Jonathan mentioned his job getting in the way of his, you know, being able to protest, but college students have also often had resources, including time, to be able to be involved, as well as the collective nature of the college experience. So, I mean, I think it's one of the most exciting things that can happen in college is whatever your cause is, and to take it on, and to be able to, young people are our future. I'm very excited about our future by looking at this millennial generation and all the things that they're doing, and I would encourage students, whether they're on the right or the left or in the middle, that where their passion lies to follow it. Whether the college, you know, the issue of bias in college education, and you know, I think is overplayed in the press. I find most classrooms that I know lots of conservative faculty, and I know our faculty are open to hearing both sides of those arguments. That's what makes great dialogue in college, is when you have the diversity of opinion in the classroom. And I know most of my colleagues at all the institutions that I've been at have relished that opportunity to have that diversity of opinion and background in their classrooms. I don't know if any of you want to add on that.
Yeah, I would just second that. I think that I think it's completely false that college professors in general are on the left. I think we're, you know, sort of centrists like most of the population. Actually, the way in which we're different, maybe, is that we really do love to have the dialogue between different positions, and the very willingness to have the dialogue, to hear multiple sides of an issue, not just two sides, but multiple sides of an issue, is itself a little bit subversive in our world today.
Yeah, I guess I could just add to this. I mean, I like a good classroom with Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman and you know, Adam Smith on the syllabus alongside people in the center, or excuse me, on the left. And that will provide a really good dialogue within the class. I mean, I just think of my last class in democracy and markets. I haven't looked at my evaluations yet, but in the past I've been criticized of being both a conservative and having too many conservative readings on the syllabus, and also as criticized as a liberal. And the idea again there is to create a safe space where people from both left and right can come together and engage each other in an intellectual discussion of respect, where political formation is not completed before you walk into the classroom, but is started in the classroom and becomes a lifelong project. So this is an important part of the education system, is to create good citizens who are critical thinkers, who are able to recognize arguments from across the political spectrum.
So at this point, we're going to get into what Jill talked about, solutions. What you guys think would be a good solution? What demands might the Occupy Wall Street group put forward? And what are the ways in which social change can manifest itself at the ground level? And how might we take a conversation like this forward? So that's open to all of you. What are your ideas?
I'll try. I think part of the solution has to do with providing opportunities. And this, I know, is somewhat vague, but what we need is a system that allows. I don't want to say everyone, but the majority, in a sense, because it's very hard to divide a system where where everyone's going to necessarily benefit from, but where the majority has opportunities to earn their fair share, and the government has a role to play. I probably would disagree with some people in terms of the size of what the government needs to do, or the size of the government in this intervention. But for sure, the government is a reallocator of resources. That's one of the primary roles of the government, is to make sure that when there's some sort of inefficiency in allocations, the government is there to provide that. And if you look at what Jill has mentioned in terms of our wage differentials, in terms of actually the inequality, it's not even about the 99% and 1%. If you actually look at the inequality, you look at these wage inequalities at smaller cities, that's where you see a lot of these skilled individuals actually prospering and the unskilled individuals actually lagging behind. It's more than just talking, it's more than just thinking about corporate greed and these things. It's more about providing the right incentives and the right opportunities for everyone. Now, how is the government going to do this? I mean, this is a very complicated issue. If our government right now is broken. If you look at the amount of debt, not deficit, debt that we have, we're about at 100% of GDP. That's the debt. If you look at the CBO projections for our debt in the next 25 or 30 years, we're going to go to about 1,000%. That's the projection. 85 or between 75 and 80% of all of that is Social Security and Medicare. So if we really have to think about creating opportunities, we really have to think about Social Security and Medicare. So if you hear anything out there that doesn't talk about these two things in terms of, you have to really argue Social Security and Medicare, because that is the biggest chunk of our debt. Right? I'm not saying that Social Security is bad or good. All I'm saying is the fact is that in terms of the government outlays right now, 80% of it is going to go to Social Security and Medicare, and we don't have resources at this point to cover that. So I think that's where we need to focus.
The other thing I would say is we could get into how to cut and deal with debt, but in terms of getting into this economic justice or inequality issue, we've got to focus on education. Back to the point I made earlier about wage growth only happening for those with college degrees since 1980. The unemployment rate right now for college graduates is 4.2% in August. That's below full employment level of 5%. Most of the unemployment in this country right now is coming from those who do not have college education. And at the same time, we can see all the data out there. If you look at wage earning, if you look at unemployment rates, etc., we are killing our public system of education in this country, particularly our community colleges. We have a president who called for everyone to try to get some college by 2020. And at the same time, we are cutting in Colorado 50% more of our public system in the coming years. And we are going to see public institutions now that are as expensive for out-of-state students as private institutions are, where there's very little financial aid relative to what there is at private institutions. So at the same time, we know that we need to invest in education, because that's going to be our future in a flat world where technology continues to grow. We're cutting our public system of education, particularly community colleges, and public education educates 75% of all college students in this country, with a lot of them being at two-year colleges. So that seems to me exactly the wrong way to go, and one of the first things that I would look at in terms of thinking about economic justice for the next generation.
Hello, I'm Marvin T. Verona, philosophy student here at Colorado College, and I suppose I prologue all this by saying I asked this as a humble man who's just seeking more information. Every time I saw one of my colleagues, I guess, my fellow students over there rising to the podium and asking questions, my heart sunk a little. I wanted my voice heard, I wanted to ask my question. You know, I didn't want to just throw away the plate on the table, I wanted to flip the buffet table. I didn't want to just break that window, I wanted to break them all. But maybe I should slow down a little. And I guess that's the type of question that I'm seeking to ask, is slowing down a little. I hear from our panel a lot of discussion about anarchy, about other societies, Polynesian societies, and how maybe we should model them. And this is just a simple question. Maybe it can be answered quickly, but I'm wondering, it seems like we're so feverish to break the system, to overturn it, bite at our knees, to munch on our jaws. And maybe it seems like there's the man, the woman who feels so little that they look at a ballot, they look at the news, all the misinformation, and they feel very depressed. They feel like they don't have the information to make a change. So they feel very apathetic. They feel like they don't have a voice inside the system. So I'm wondering if maybe before all the talk about breaking the system, about flipping the buffet table, if we think about a way to involve more people in the current system. It seems like I hear all these statistics constantly about how only the last election saw a pretty good outturn because it was Barack Obama after all, but all previous elections before that and elections after that haven't really had a great voter turnout. And it seems like maybe that might be part of the problem. So I guess what I'm asking, specifically Jonathan Lee, and specifically to, I'm so sorry, I forgot your name. Yeah, before these, so sorry.
It's okay.
I've had him as a professor. Before overthrowing the system, what about incorporating more people into the current one? Voter turnouts, et cetera, et cetera. Thank you.
I completely hear what you're saying because I voted today and I know that it was a waste of my time because I know that my vote, I know where I live and I know how I vote and I know that I am not in the majority and every time I vote, it's me spitting in the wind and I know that. And so I think you addressed something really important here. Why don't people get involved? And maybe this is something about what Jonathan was saying about cultural differences between the United States and other countries. It's very hard to get people to do something over and over and over again when they know that talking. When they talk, they're not heard. When they say something, they're not listened to. And that's why it seems that this is a very complicated issue. But one of the important things, and I think part of the brilliance of Occupy Wall Street, is it's not just one voice. You don't have to be in the majority for your voice to be heard. You can be in the minority. You can be just you and still have your voice be heard. And I think that sometimes just having those voices heard, one of the things I study is innovation. And one of the things we know is that really innovative ideas often do not come from the center. They don't come from the place where everyone's connected and everyone's in there and everyone's doing stuff. Really innovative ideas very frequently come from the edges. They come from people who are a little bit disconnected, or sometimes a lot disconnected. So the solutions to these problems, I'm sitting there thinking, oh God, solutions to the problems. I don't have any solutions to the problems. But the solutions are out there. The solutions are out there. That man and that woman who are sitting in their house thinking, I'm not going to go vote because I know my vote doesn't count, right? Why would I bother? Those people have solutions. If we can have a mechanism where those voices are heard, that's where the innovative ideas are going to come from. And so I think that that part of maybe fixing the system, first of all, is finding a way for those voices to be heard. John was talking about the 70s when there was, one telephone company. There were also 3 television stations and there was no internet. Part of the reason this is happening now is because for the first time, we have the means for a lot of different voices to be heard. And I think you're exactly right.
I would just second what Kathy says. If the system could be fixed, it would only be fixable because we get more voices into it. So.
And just another part of that, the Occupy Wall Street are working within this system. They're exercising their freedom of speech. They're exercising their freedom of assembly. And they're helping us construct what the Republic wants. Now, I've been down to Acacia Park and I've read a lot of the literature and I don't agree with a lot of things that are in that literature, and that's fine, but there's a huge voice here for, hey, the way things are going is not great, and we need to fix them, and there's a bottom-up expression of that, an attempt to reframe what this republic stands for. So in that, and again, with the Tea Party, which was an exercise in the exact same thing with a different set of agendas, this is what Americans do. This is what democracies do. It's a good thing.
Once again, I'd like to thank everybody for attending and devoting some attention to this. one of the things, as being somebody that's been involved with the Occupy movement, both Occupy Denver and Occupy Colorado Springs for some time, that I want people to be aware of is that this is not so much a right or left issue. We're seeing actually people, you know, I've seen a lot of interest trying to portray this necessarily as a leftist issue. And I myself am a Republican. I work in construction. I have a little bit of what some would consider conservative views, but I know that this is an important enough issue to spend my time on, because what I'm worried about is everybody's future here, and everybody's children's futures here. One of the things I would like for us to perhaps touch on is what we think the potential exposure that our economy has due to the derivatives market. The derivatives market right now, we're looking at, for instance, here's a good example. Bank of America, when they purchased Merrill Lynch during the last economic crisis and brought them into the fold, acquired what was essentially 55 on a conservative side to 75 trillion, that's trillion with a T, in what we could refer to as toxic assets. Now, due to the removal of the Glass-Steagall Act, which happened underneath Bill Clinton's presidency, this opened up a doorway for something that's potentially worse than anything we've looked at so far with our economy. What we're seeing is Bank of America, now that they have these toxic assets, are talking about moving them from the investment side of Bank of America to the depository side. And the problem is that with that depository side, that's going to open up that exposure once these derivatives go bad, which are essentially insurance policies, many of them being tied to the European market, that when they go bad, these insurance policies are going to have to be paid out. Now keep in mind that our federal deficit is 14.1 trillion, and we're looking at anywhere from 4 to 5 times that in exposure. But once those get moved over to the depository arm, we're looking at those monies being insured by the FDIC. Now, many of you know about the FDIC because they essentially act as insurance on your bank accounts. But what happens if these funds, essentially, once we see these derivatives bail out, what's going to happen with these funds? Another thing that I want to point out too is, you know, there's a lot of with Occupy Wall Street and Occupy Colorado Springs that what we're paying attention to is this is not just, you know, something against obviously corporations. That's not the issue. Many of us are capitalists. We also look at the government complicity in this. Hence our disappointment with perhaps Obama and the fact that we looked at Timothy Geithner, Larry Summers, Henry Paulson still being involved essentially with this incestuous relationship between governments, so that we have this rotating field of politics, passing law, you know, legislation that makes it easier for businesses to earn money. So my question is going to be for you guys: why is it that we're constantly, you know, under the impression that this is a left issue, when honestly on the ground with the troops that I'm seeing, with the people I'm seeing become involved, I'm seeing a ton of Tea Partiers, I'm seeing a ton of constitutionalists, and I want to, you know, see what you guys thought about, you know, why we aren't addressing the fact on the front page of the newspaper why the Federal Reserve is giving out $16.1 trillion in secret bailouts to not just American banks, but to foreign banks as well, such as Royal Bank of Scotland, UBS, which is a Swiss bank, PNB, which is a French bank. I mean, we give them trillions of dollars, and that 16.1 is still $2 trillion in excess of what our actual federal deficit is. And, you know, as educators, why is it that we're not seeing perhaps that being also the focus in terms of the public's reaction and also what you guys are helping people become aware of as educators?
I'll just address the one little bit about the left. I think that, honestly, it's being portrayed as a leftist movement because that's a way to discredit it in the United States.
To address something a little more, you know, our dependency on derivatives and derivative market. It's actually, if you look at the data, it's much worse than that. Derivatives are created for you to, in a sense, diversify some sort of risk, right? That's the purpose of a derivative, an option, or whatever it is. It's a financial instrument for you to in a sense, hedge yourself against these problems. The reason why I say it's worse is if you look at Federal Reserve balance sheet over the last 3 years. In the Federal Reserve balance sheet, if you look at a balance sheet, the liability of the Federal Reserve is the currency in circulation, it's the dollars that are out there, right? And those dollars that are out there need to be backed up by assets. Right now, the composition of the Federal Reserve balance sheet, about 40% of it is in mortgage-backed securities. That's what they have is backing our currency out there. That is actually much worse than corporations dealing derivatives to each other, I think, because remember, the Federal Reserve is the lender of last resort, and if right now, if we were out there and we wanted to redeem our dollars, right, I'm going to give you your liability, I want an asset, what would we get back would be those mortgage-backed securities, which are worthless at this point.
You can't quantify the risk.
Right. So that's I think is from a macroeconomic perspective, that would be the most difficult thing to think about. So if these mortgage-backed securities don't go up in value, that is, if housing prices don't go up in value, we might have a serious problem.
We do.
Hi, I'm Dwight. I'm a speaker at CC. I have a very, very brief question. So I'm going to allow myself, excuse me, to very, very, very briefly occupy the microphone before I ask my question. There have been some very excellent and articles in the past recently about activism at CC and the deplorable lack of student involvement, specifically in the Occupy movement. That is, there are students who are involved in this movement. And of course, the trouble is, pointed out, this is a non-hierarchical participatory movement. So what that means, effectively, is that in order to get involved, you have to get involved. And which is to say that it would be contrary to the movement's purposes if there was some kind of, regionally organized CC, like an Occupy Club or something. But that being said, it's very difficult. It's not as easy as just to say get involved. It's very difficult. So I've been trying to set up a sort of listserv just to coordinate between people who are interested in getting involved, interested in any broad sort of activism, not solely about anybody's interested. Find me afterwards. In a similar vein, my question, I think a lot of students do want to get involved. And I think one of the problems in our contemporary world is that there's, as a lot of people pointed out, there's this huge proliferation of different media. And so there's, more than ever, a sort of multiplicity of ways to be informed. I'd just like to ask all of you, many of you, what sources of media, what publications you read on a daily and near daily basis to be as important to organizations. Thanks.
I just want to say one brief thing about the things that I read that I think is very, very important for all of us, especially since we have access to the internet, to read sources of news that don't come from within the United States. If you live in, so you can get lots and lots of things online. The more languages you speak, the more you have open to you. If you only speak English, you should definitely be reading The Guardian every day. But I think that one of the things, and I think this touches on what a lot of our panelists have said about having multiple points of view, is it's really important not to just read media that you agree with. It's really important to read media from all over the spectrum, because you need to know what everyone says, and you can the wonderful thing about the internet is you can have it all.
And I would highly recommend The Economist as well as The Guardian if you're going to read on those sites. Great read, it's a wonderful thing for international. The nation. Also the
I was remarks at Ben
I couldn't hear you, I'm sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Why not?
That's a good question.
I'll say one thing about why not anarchy. I think that we need to understand that if there was a level playing field, that would be one thing, but there's not a level playing field. Sometimes when there isn't any sort of state authority, what ends up happening is that people who have access to power of some sort, including fiscal power, often use it. You can think about that on the state level. You can think about it on an individual personal level. Do you want this room? Do you want your lives to be dominated by people who are physically stronger? Or do we want some protections for people who are weaker? And how do we protect people who are weaker? We end up setting up authorities to do that. And so Jonathan may disagree with me, but I would say that one of the reasons why not anarchy is to protect the weak from the strong. That's what governments do.
And I would just, I don't disagree. I would just say that anarchism is not anarchy. These are two different concepts, right? And anarchism is really a kind of aspirational ideal, which could guide how we might begin to rethink the institutions that we live in. I'm certainly not advocating anarchy, but anarchism as radical, non-hierarchical democracy is a whole other thing.
I have a question a little more specific, kind of relevant to Colorado Springs' interests, which is about defense spending. We talk a lot about entitlement programs, Social Security, Medicare, labor that, of course, has such a hugely inflated part of our spending. But why doesn't anyone, people are talking about it obviously, but why isn't the bigger question about defense spending, which we spend way more than any other nation in the world, most nations combined could equal our spending. Why is it that, is it just a question of jobs, because defense spending creates jobs, versus, entitlement programs, and why is it not being done?
That's a huge question, and as a specialist in post-Congress politics, first of all, you have to realize that most defense contractors have spread their benefits widely. I think of all 435 congressional districts, you probably find a net defense contract in just about each and every single one of them. Also, again, you have to think about Adam Smith once said, we have to worry about the merchants and the manufacturers because anytime they get together, even if just socially, they will conspire together to raise prices against the public. There is this distrust in classical liberal economics of concentrated, unguarded political power, right? And again, this is a problem with our democracy in general. And again, we can just go back to Republican President Dwight Eisenhower and his closing warnings about the defense industrial complex. There are a lot of people who are willing to put their money where their mouth is to ensure that those defense contracts keep on going. How many of you have hired a lobbyist lately to save $5 on your next on the steel in your next car purchase? Okay, so you understand the point here that there is a certain collective action problem that concentrated interests are able to overcome. And that's the importance of a robust democracy that is able to reveal the conspiracy of the merchants and manufacturers, whoever they may be, and it's all our interest to go ahead and try to get away with these things. And it's also our interest as people who are outside of that to guard against it. So again, an informed, active citizen is exercising the freedom of speech, freedom to gather information, all of it, the freedom to assemble, is a very important guardian against this.
I'm involved in currency or banks. Right? So the prediction of that theory would be that that would create a private market for money, where, let's say, Chase and Wells Fargo and other banks would issue their own currency, and the market would calculate the exchange rate between them. If you work through this model, and with very simplistic assumptions, what ends up happening is that you end up with very few currencies in circulation. You end up with two or three currencies in circulation. Because what ends up happening is that if you have multiple institutions issuing different currencies, it becomes very hard to identify the value of things because of the exchange rates. You don't know what's worth what. Who's controlling the money supply, right? Is it Chase who's issuing more, and therefore their currency is devaluing? Is it Wells Fargo, and so forth, right? So what ends up happening is that in the long run, or in equilibrium, is that you end up with, again, not a lot of currency. So that would be the argument for having a centralized system with one particular currency, right? I'm not. I would love to see that system as a researcher, as an academic. It would be great to see that, because what we're talking about here are counterfactuals, right? What we have here is a system that is dictated by a central bank. We haven't seen that counterfactual yet. That is, we haven't seen a system under the same circumstances without the central bank. We can only hypothesize about what would have happened. It's very difficult to think about a system with multiple currencies within a particular, and so I think it's a great theoretical question. I'm not certain that implementability would be something that would be as simple as